welcome everybody to the second staff seminar of New Era University College. Today we are very glad to have with us Dr. Jason Ng, who says he is a banana, but working on a very Chinese topic. Now, Jason was educated, just now we say, in John Catholic High School in PJ. So obviously your Chinese must be okay, must be pretty good. Much better than a lot of us. And then he went on to do his degree in geology in America. Now, incidentally, I did geography, so we are in the same field. You look underground, I look on the surface. But then he switched to history, another degree in history, plus a master's also in history at Arizona State University in the United States, and then a PhD in Melbourne University, working on this topic about the Malaysian emergency or insurgency and things like that. So Jason has been working on this topic more or less since then. So one of those few people who have done a lot of work on this topic. By the way, New Era University College has collected quite a lot of materials on this group of people. I think it's available online. If you speak to the computer center, you may be able to refer to this material, which actually have not been used very much. So now what is the topic? Maybe you would. I can't remember your topic. So now we would have about 1.5 to 2 hours today. Jason will be speaking for about an hour or so, or a bit more, and then we will have Q&A after that. So you might like to pose your questions in Chinese, in English, or in Bahasa. So he can take it off. So without much further ado, I invite Jason to end his talk. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Dr. Voon, for the nice introduction. Yes, my Chinese is functional, I would like to say, and but I'll try my best. And so if you have questions in Chinese and Malay, I will try my best to answer in that regard, so that maybe you can make it easier. But without much further ado, I like to start. And thanks for coming, everyone. And I'd like to make a little announcement. My old mentor who put me on this road is here, Dr. James Rush. You can see his name there, Dr. James Rush from Arizona State University. He's the one who supervised my master's thesis, so thanks to him. He's my first mentor, which I great respect. And in fact, my master's thesis topic was derived from, inspired by his words, what he suggested to me. So today's topic is also similarly based on my own master's topic, because I think this is a very good title and a very appropriate title for what I'm about to share today. And well, there's just a few things I want to say before I start, is that today's seminar is not meant to rewrite history. It is more of a sort of touching base with what we know about this period in Malaysian history, and also try to retrace some of the things we know and what we don't know. And there'll be holes in there. I don't claim to fill in everything. There'll be details. I couldn't put everything given the time. This is something that I've been working on since 2009, 2010. So even then, it's still an ongoing project. It never ends, because every year there's something new. There's something that pops up from here, from here and there. You know, for example, you know, I found some artifacts in Stanford University in California. I mean, actual first-hand artifacts there. And I mean, I even found the original speech by Tan Cheng Lock there. So things popped up here and there, and so you fills up some gaps. And why is this fragmented? Well, I hope that I will have a discussion on that. So without much further ado, let me start with my slides. I hope that everybody can see, right? Can everybody see this? Yep. All right. So basically, this revolution, I call it, is silence, right? Because for various political and social and cultural reasons, right? This has been a silent revolution because most generation never heard of it. Excuse me a second. All right, most new generation Malaysians would not know. In fact, my generation itself, I grew up in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and 2000s. We never heard about this. And we thought that this is something that's long buried, forgotten. And then imagine my shock in 1989 when I heard that, oh, there was a peace agreement. And I see a bunch of people in green fatigues signing this peace agreement. And I asked my dad, who is a serviceman in the Royal Malaysian Air Force, so what is this about? He couldn't find ways to describe to me in so many words. And he just told me there were this bunch of people who hide in the mountains and kill people. I'm like, that's scary. So, well, that's basically what it is. And coupled with, and I told this story many times to many people, right? What made me interested in this is because of my childhood. When you grew up, a son of a serviceman, and your neighbors are all fellow children's servicemen, right? And you hear people calling you names like, China Communist. My dad was very, very upset with this. I mean, he gave 22 of his life to the Air Force, and this is what he gets, to be his son being called a communist. I'm like, what is a communist? My dad refused to talk to me about it for many years. It took me many years until high school, even high school, my time in high school. And as some of you know about the controversy in the Form 4 Sejarah textbook, right? Where they dedicate an entire chapter talking about emergency. Yet, my time, it was only one paragraph. And I'm like, what's this? It took me many years to come to this point. And when I finally managed to read up about it in university, that's when I was doing my geology major. And I'm like, this is not what I want to do. I'm more interested in this. And I started digging. And then when I got accepted to Arizona State, that's when my whole world opened up, because they have a bigger library and more complete set of documents, and they have better connections, interlibrary loans and all that. I started reading, and I read and read and read. I mean, you can ask Dr. Rush, when every time he saw me, he was looking at a panda. I mean, literally a panda. So it was quite an experience. And as I finished my master thesis, then my PhD, I found out that I thought I knew a lot. Actually, I don't. I mean, I even met fellow scholars who did this, and some of them are here today. And it made me feel that, this is a project that probably won't finish even the day I die. It's just so much buried. And these people, these communists, right? We put values on them. They're bad. I think we should, first of all, step away from that. We do not attach values to it, and try to see history for what it is, a history. I said, it's not a moral journey of advocating what's right, what's wrong. Although if you were looking from a nationalist historical point of view, you would say that. The British would more than happy tell you that colonialism is good. Look at you guys. We gave you civilization. I was like, really? And therefore communism is bad. Okay, well, we can debate that. I wouldn't say they're good or bad, but we'll look at history, right? So for this silence revolutionings, right? What do we know? How it started? Nobody knows. And I must give thanks to Dr. Yang Chin-Fat. Yang Chin-Fat was, when he passed away, he left all his books to Nira University College, which is why I'm here. I'm really happy. I'm very happy to get to be so close to his books and his materials. And he did a lot of the legwork for us. But yet, how come we never hear about it? It's one of the biggest mystery, right? So let me start with how it all began in Malaya, or British Malaya in that time, right? We all know that Marxism began, actually, I would say that Marxism began in Malaya, come from two directions. But the one direction that's the clearest and the most strongest is from China. The other one will be from Indonesia, the Dutch East Indies, which I'll talk about in a second. So we know that many of the first wave, Dr. Young called it the first wave, right? of Marxists came from those who were inspired by the May 4th movement. This was before the founding of the Chinese Communist Party, in fact, right? It all started there. But the idea of anarcho-communism is what probably set the stage. A lot of people forgot about this, and I put the Chinese meaning for those of you who doesn't understand what I'm talking about. Basically, an idea of total anarchy in communism, the idea that without a structured government, people will come together and live in a communal peace because there's nobody above you or below you. We're all the same. It sounds ideal, but it doesn't work very, very well in practice. We know this from history. And these people were advocating for throwing all aspects of tradition and all the structured way of government and all that out the window. We want to go back to the simple way of where everybody's the same, anarcho-communism, right? So when the nationalist government took power in the wake of the fall of the Qing dynasty, right? And especially after the May 4th movement where there was repression, many of these thinkers, many of them were learned people, right? Not workers, but thinkers, intellectuals, teachers, journalists, and all that. They came to Malaya looking for a better life. Well, mostly to escape, and because they couldn't stay there. I mean, to be dragged in by the secret police of the Kuomintang is a very scary thought, right? So based on what Dr. Yong has found out is that Singapore was initially the first landing spot. And that's when the Zhen She, the True Society, was established, right? And we have this several individuals, the learned individuals, you know, who came in and began this whole movement. I mean, the True Society is a branch. I mean, it had a branch in Manila as well. And Singapore was the latest branch. And basically, they have all these individuals, you know, Wu Dunming, Zhang Hongchen, Fan Changpu, who I can never read that Chinese word, right? And Wang Yuting, they all came, you know, as you can see, the years, the dates of arrival and the years they were banished, they didn't stay very long, right? Except for Zhang Hongchen. Zhang Hongchen actually moved to Medan across the Straits of Malacca to Sumatra, right? And basically worked as a railroad labor agitator, and that's when the Dutch put him in jail for a few years before kicking him back to China. But what happened here is that they set the stage. They say, oh, well, this Singapore, and to a certain extent, they focus on Singapore and the Strait settlements. Not much in Penang, but they did go there to did some work, and Malacca as well, but mostly Singapore. And a little bit in states like the Federated Malay States. For those who know Malaysian history, right? The Malay states were divided into the federated and the unfederated Malay states. And for example, the biggest and the most populous one probably at the time was Selangor. And they founded this, the Yi Qun Bao, the Yi Quan Bo, in 1919, shortly after Wu Dunming arrived, right? And basically, it's a paper that advocates this whole idea of anarcho-communism. And it was quite popular for a while, not super popular, but enough intellectual Chinese were convinced, especially those who could not stand the kind of nationalism that the Kuomintang was promoting in China and moved down here, right? Not so much of the working class, but mostly on the intellectual class, right? Now, but the anarcho-communists, as you can know, a lot of them were arrested for causing trouble by the Strait settlements, police and authorities, and they were banished. They were not allowed to come back, and many of them never did. You know, they ended up in other places, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, back in China. Back then, they were not like wanted by the Kuomintang, but just that they have to go back and make a living elsewhere. Some disappeared, nobody knows. But what we know is that Zhang Hongchen did return. Zhang Hongchen was an anarcho-communist, just like Wu Dunming, but when he was back in China, right, he was convinced by this new wave of communism advocated by Chen Duxiu's, Chinese Communist Party. And in 1925, he switched, he basically converted from an anarcho-communism to actually communism, right? And he participated in the failed Canton uprising, the Guangzhou Chieh, right? Failed, but he survived, and partly because of his knowledge of Malaya and Singapore as well. When we say Malaya, I'm including Singapore at this point, right? The CCP decided to send him back, right, to start a branch of the CCP, which they call the Nanyang Provincial Committee, which many scholars, including myself, have mistakenly called it the Nanyang Communist Party. That's the mistake. They were never a party. They were a provincial committee. They were supposed to be an extension of the CCP, knowing that this in Nanyang or the South Seas, Malaya especially, and which includes, incidentally, Nanyang does include Indonesia, Thailand, Philippines when they talk about Nanyang, and even Vietnam. I heard in some ways, but Nanyang is not reserved for Malaya or Singapore. It's a huge area, and so the NPC was set up as a branch. Very obvious, Zhang Hongchen was there, but within 3 months he was arrested, and they banished him. He wasn't killed, but he was banished. Right. So there goes the first attempt to do that. By the way, what happened to anarcho-communism? Once Wu Dunming and everyone else was arrested and sent back, the whole movement died. Yi Qunbao survived for 17 years, continued publishing articles and all that, but by then, not many people read anyway, so it sort of fizzled out by itself. Right. So this is when the CCP returns and basically replace it with their brand of communism, right? So at this time, between 1921 and 1924, right, most Chinese communists, especially those who were inspired or became card-carrying members of the CCP, arrived in KL. Singapore was no longer the capital of communist activity, but KL is. This is because in the Strait settlements where British laws were more stronger, there was much more surveillance, and Kuala Lumpur was relatively new, sort of unlike Singapore, which had a far longer development. Kuala Lumpur is as a federal Malay state. It is not part of the Strait settlement, so there was a little bit more leeway, and it's a bigger area to run around. I mean, more jungles to hide, right? When the cops come for you, right? So this is when most of the journalists and school teachers come from China. They were invited by the Chinese communities here to work here because they needed experts. There was no homegrown talents at the time, right? And what we found out was, if you know about the Zhonghua School in Setapak, right? The first headmaster, Dong Fangchen, right? He formed the first cell. You know, as the headmaster, he got all these teachers who were really I won't say hardcore, but committed communists to become teachers at school. And he basically allowed the syllabus. Back then there was no uniform syllabus, right? So he basically let the teachers inculcate all these communist ideals to the kids, and it was very, very successful. And some of these journalists and school teachers even formed the Nanyang Critique. It's basically a short-lived magazine, advocating communism, and strangely, it also advocates anarcho-communism, which we thought would have died at this time, but they did that, but it was shut down once when its first and last editor was arrested, right? And then there was also the Nanming Xueguan, right? Basically a night school. It only lasted for 1 year and then it was shut down. It was where they radicalized a lot of the Hainanese, right? So this kind of movement didn't cause much wave in Malaya. Dong Fangchen's cell did not grow very much. I mean, they occasionally had meetings and all that. They were always being followed and always being observed by the special branch, right? But nothing really came out of it. Occasionally, they were arrested for writing seditious articles, but other than that, nothing. They didn't really attract too much attention until Zhang Hongchen came back, right? And he came with 4 other CCP men, which I have failed to know. I haven't failed to discover yet. And they formed the Nanyang Provincial Committee as the actual first organized movement. And that's when the second wave arrived, right? Now, in this time period, we know that the Kuomintang and the communists and the CCP were allied, right? The first united front, right? But a lot of them were unhappy because, you know, the radical left of the Kuomintang and the right, you know, the conservative right were already having issues. And this is just prior to the breakaway, the what you call the separation, right? So there were a lot of radical Shanghai students. Some of them had participated in the May 4th movement, you know, so they were very radicalized. And some of the Kuomintang leftists who felt that they did not have a place at the table in China. So they said, you know what, forget about this. I'm going down to Nanyang where there's a lot of Chinese there where I can do something, right? And then the Chinese communists from Guangdong, Hainan, who felt that they want to do more by spreading this to the community in Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and to some extent Philippines as well. So they came down, right? And these were the also sort of intellectuals, but they're different kind, all right? And what made a lot of them become extremely radicalized, swing to the extreme left, was the May 30 incident in Shanghai. Now, for those of you who do not know what happened, a Japanese factory in Shanghai basically had strike breakers beating and killing Chinese workers, and that provoked a lot of anger among the left, you know, in China, saying, oh wow, you know, the Kuomintang allow this Japanese business owners, right, to kill our workers just because they demand better treatment and better salary. So it was something that really, I mean, the Chinese were already unhappy with how the Japanese have been very haughty, because Japan was on the rise at the time, we must understand. So May 30 incident in Shanghai was the one that really made a lot of people angry, and they see how worthless, how powerless the Kuomintang government in dealing with this incident. Instead of, you know, demanding the Japanese compensate, they just basically tell the rioters and the protesters, you know, just go back home and do nothing. China was at the crossroads at the time, and it was still at the time where warlordism is still very active, right? But the CCP at that time, right, formed this Nanyang Regional Committee. It was formed in Beijing, and we call this the main school. And this was the precursor to the provincial committee in Malaya, right? Then they changed the name to local committee. Then when Zhang Hongchen came down, it became the Nanyang Provincial Committee, right? And what really put the Nanyang Provincial Committee on the Strait Settlement Police radar and the special branch was the Greater Ayah incident. Greater Ayah today is the Chinatown in Singapore, for those who don't know, right? 12 March 1927 was the second anniversary of Sun Yat-sen's passing, and the NPC decided to hold a massive parade, remembering this, you know, great father. They call him the Prof. And the police would not allow it because they said this is just too, it would turn into a riot, and it did because the police tried to break up the parade, and there was a fight, and from that onwards, the police were hunting down all the leaders and arresting members of the NPC, especially the leadership. Now, the thing about the special branch is they knew that the only way to stop this kind of movement was to take away the leaders, hunt down the leaders and banish them. They didn't kill them, but they banished them. But the thing about the NPC is that, and subsequently the MCP later on, by this time, there were abundant of talents who are talents as in agitators, you know, labor organizers, and many intellectuals who were well-versed in the Marxist ideology. So there was never a lack of local leaders. And most of them came from China, right? There was not many, I would say almost no Malayan-born or Singapore-born intellectuals. All of them are China. So this is a part where a lot of people didn't understand. A lot of people say that, okay, well, they are basically Chinese stooges. I wouldn't say Chinese stooges, but they were inspired and led. And basically, they were still acting under CCP orders because they see themselves as part of China, right? We should know this, until independence, most Chinese individuals in Malaya and Singapore see themselves as citizens of China, with exception of a small minority of English-educated Chinese in the Strait settlements of Singapore, Malacca, and Penang, where they see themselves as British subjects. Most of them, especially in the Malay states, do not see themselves as citizens of anywhere else. So there is a divide there. Even back then, the Chinese community has fractured, right? Then you have the Baba and Nyonya, the Peranakan, you know, everybody is different, right? The Chinese educated don't see themselves have anything to do with the English educated. So, and the feeling's mutual, right? Now, there's one thing I want to point out is that early Malayan communist movement were dominated by the Hainanese, right? So sorry if some of you are Hainanese, right? It's not meant as a slight, right? But it's just that many of the Hainanese who came down to Malaya were from the working class, right? They came to seek a better life. And plus, Hainan Island is considered much closer to Malaya by a little bit compared to mainland China. So a lot of them, you know, just took the sea route and came down. And it was much easier because when you want to infiltrate Malaya with so many Hainanese community, right, all over the peninsula, you would naturally train the Hainanese. This is what the CCP did because you have relatives there who would shelter you when you arrive, right? And it's easier to sort of convince them of the Marxist movement because they were working class, they felt that, you know, although they came down to Malaya for better life, but they felt that they're still being repressed. So it's easier to provoke or to ignite that sense of injustice, you know, that they escaped from China to start a new life, but yet they still felt that, you know, they're the answer to a different kind of master, which is no better than what's China, but still. And so a lot of the Hainanese, you know, they attended night schools organized by the same Marxist inclined teachers. You know, many of them were illiterate. So when they go to night schools, oh, guess what? What's the textbooks? It's Marxist theology, Marxist ideology, right? So at the same time, you know, you teach them how to read and write, but you introduce communist thoughts or Marxist thoughts. And this is how a lot of them were convinced, oh, okay, I can be, you know, I can do something for this, right? So many of them joined the Nanyang Communist Youth League, which strangely has nothing to do with the Nanyang Provisional Committee. It's sort of like a rival group, but yet they are also on the same page. So the Hainanese community, right, the first to be organized by communist agents were the Hainanese community in Singapore, which is very interesting. So the Hainanese were the first to be radicalized. And this is something that will affect the party, the Malayan Communist Party in the long run, in the future, right? But then again, I did mention in the beginning that, you know, Malaya's sort of embrace of communism has another direction, which is from the Dutch East Indies. And this is done by the PKI, the PKI, the Perserikatan Komunis di India, right? They were radicalized. I'm not going to go into the history of PKI, but just know that, you know, the Indonesian Malays were radicalized, especially the laborers, and they were introduced to this by the Dutch communists. So many of them, especially when they were hunted down by the Dutch authorities, they would escape to British Malaya. And because they did not commit crime in Malaya, they're safe. But they brought with them their ideals. And these were the earliest Malay communists. Most of them were, quote unquote, in the Indonesians, right, or Malays, right? And like Semaun, you know, he was in Singapore, and when he was staying there, he tried to organize the local Indonesians, or we would call Indonesians today, into a local cell. He did try to sort of put up feelers to local Malays, but he found out that they were not interested. They were content with their life, and they see these Indonesians as, you know, upstarts, you know, troublemakers, so they ignore them. And then we have Tan Malaka, who became a Comintern agent, right? He's had the same opinion. He said that, you know, there were two traditionalists, the British Malays, true traditionalists. So basically, very few local Malays would join the PKI. Right? The PKI basically mostly had Indonesians, especially many were trying to escape the Dutch, right? But what PKI did in Singapore was they made contact with the Nanyang Provisional Committee, right? The main school first, and then later NPC. And they found out that, well, they have the same idea of internationalism, global revolution, but the PKI was focused on the Dutch East Indies. Their enemies were the Dutch, not the British. That's why the British left them alone, right? And although, and the NPC knew that, they need the help of the Malays and the Indians, right? Because they could mobilize the Chinese, but not the Malays. And the PKI said they can't do anything. They're not interested in helping the NPC get the Malays to join. So although they were friends, they had different objectives, and that's the problem, right? They did sort of open up the membership to get Malay Indian support. Some did sign up, but here's the problem. The NPC were overwhelmingly Chinese. There were little to very few, I would say, bilingual members who could translate and help them. So many of the Malays decided that after they joined the NPC, they just switched to PKI. Might as well join somebody where I can understand what they're saying. Right? Same with the Indians. Right? So the NPC, right? Just to repeat a little bit, if you can see, this is part of the list of the standing committee members, right? They're mostly Hainanese, right? Only Fu Daqing is Jiangxi. The rest are not. But here's the thing. NPC was directed by the Chinese Communist Party to organize. So it wasn't Kuomintang approval. The Kuomintang was not happy about it. Kuomintang envisioned a Southeast Asian localized revolution consists of their local parties, right? But then again, you have the Chinese who thought, who came down to Malaya and doing this. So it was nothing the Kuomintang could do. Although the Kuomintang were interested in sort of separating this, and they would be very successful. And then we have the third wave of Chinese communists who basically escaping China when Chiang Kai-shek began the suppression of the left, and the first civil war in China began. And many of them escaped, and they came here, right, and joined the NPC, and they were intellectuals, and they very quickly they took over the NPC and basically became its leaders. And you can see, right, we have Wu Qing, Fu Daqing, and Lin Qingchong. Fu Daqing is probably Fu Daqing is the one probably lasted the longest, but he has the most impact on that, right? So when Kuomintang sort of decided to take advantage. Now, let me go back a little bit. Even though the Nanyang Provisional Committee was set up as a satellite of the Chinese Communist Party, right? The Kuomintang found out that when the party itself, the CCP, was trying to flee Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist army, they couldn't be focused on what's happening here, not too much anyway. So this is a good opportunity for the Kuomintang to sort of divorce these two groups, and they did, right? So they sent Ho Chi Minh down, okay, and Ho Chi Minh basically, right, came down, and I'm jumping ahead of time here, but basically Ho Chi Minh as an agent of Kuomintang for Southeast Asia, aside from Tan Malacca and Ali Min. Ali Min is also another PKI leader, right? A Malay, Indonesian Malay communist leader. They basically came and told the NPC that, look, you guys need to be more Malayan. Yes, you support China, but you are not in China. You have to mobilize the majority, which is the Malays, and then get the Indians as well. Hopefully we can spread this to India as well. So when the MCP, the Malayan Communist Party, was formed at that time, they also formed the Malayan General Labour Union at the same time, April. I'll go to that quickly. But what little information we knew is that we did get Malay members. These are local Malays. I think, not Malays. Many of them were Indonesians, right? They were Singapore and Malacca. And they were some members of the party, the NPC, and some members of the provincial committee who could speak Malay, and they managed to radicalize them, and they got it, right? And the first Malay branch was actually formed in Malacca town, which back then was called Pantai. Malacca was the first, right? But very quickly, Ali Majid, Ahmad Baiki, Abdul Rahman were arrested. Here's the thing though, everything we know about this, why we know so much, is because all this information came from Special Branch. The police have been watching them since day one, which is ironic when you think about it. it wasn't come from, all this information did not come from the party itself. In fact, in my conversation with some of the old communists up in Betong, Thailand, they still wouldn't declassify their files because they're still afraid of what's inside, and and they wouldn't share much. And these are from British sources, and this is one issue that I've felt that it's still unresolved, because as long as those files remain hidden, we'll never know the true story. Right? And as historians, we should ferret it out. But then that's another story for another time. Right? Now, here comes the question. People argue about when was it founded. Well, we have different dates, right? Everybody comes up with, because the information they have is so different, right? But basically, most people agree it's 1930. I don't know why Chia Boon King came to a conclusion 1932. I mean, I wish I could ask him, but then again, everybody says differently, right? The special branch says it's in Kuala Pilar, right? Fu Yongting, right, one of the labor union leaders who was later banished, he confirmed to Dr. Yong that it was in early to mid-April, the first 2 weeks of April, and it was in Bulo Gesap. I do not really know where exactly, but we just have to go by whatever, because in the absence of actual data, I mean, even my own interviews with some of the elders in the peace villages in Betong told me that, this was done in somewhere in northern Johor, where, I mean, I even have stories, some people told me in Tangkak, in Segamat, up there, even Palo, not say Palo, sorry, Pago. I was like, so where? Nobody knew. Everybody tells a different story. But then again, the ones I'm talking to are not like members of the Central Committee, so that's also another issue, right? So basically, we really don't know. We can say in 1930, that's the closest, right? But here's the thing. What we know is that they had a meeting in a rubber estate, in a small hut, right? If you read Chin Peng's My Side of History, he would say that it was in a small hidden spot, or a hut for the rubber tappers, right? And the Malayan General Labor Union was founded at the same meeting. A lot of people didn't know that, right? And of course, Ho Chi Minh was there, right? So Ho Chi Minh, one thing about Ho Chi Minh is that he had a bigger vision than most people give him credit for. And I'll talk about what he said later on, right? We do know that many delegates were there, and the Malay leaders, Malay members who were in Malacca were supposed to attend it, but they were arrested, as we know. And this was a major coup for a special branch, because it basically denies the MCP legitimacy from the start, saying that, well, you don't have Malay leaders, and there were no Indian leaders as well, right? But we do know that shortly, right, a week or two after the founding, right, they had another meeting on 24 Nassim Road in Singapore, where they were supposed to celebrate May Day. They were discussing how to celebrate May Day, May 1st, right? And sadly, right, they got raided. Most of the first generation leaders were arrested, right? And this is how the house looks like today. It's sort of off the main road, sort of hidden, a very colonial style, right? It's very nice looking, and it was a bungalow back then. It belongs to one British family, right? And it was used by the communist leaders when they were away in Shanghai. So, that's how it happened. You can still visit that. And the Malay, as I said, the Malay representatives were not absent, but the Indians did not show up because they were not interested. They were focused on freeing their own country. Right? Indians were saying, "Oh, I want to, see India free. The free India, the Azad Hind movement was very hot at the time." So what we can say is, the MCP got off with a very bad start. They were extremely weak, right? The Far East Bureau of Comintern, right, based in Shanghai, basically, they managed to split the provincial committee away from from Chinese Communist Party's control and basically create a new party. And instead of having one party that covers everyone, this will focus on in British Malaya, which includes Singapore, right? So as we know, the Great Depression began at this time, and a lot of people were jobless, and this is perfect for the proletariat revolution, so to speak. So Ho Chi Minh and Li San, right, were the mastermind who sort of changed this. This is something that people know. And in fact, the following year, Serge Lefranc or Joseph Ducroix supposed to deliver 50,000 Straits dollars in gold bars, right, to help the party. Right? Of course, Joseph Ducroix's arrest actually, stops the financial support from the Far East Bureau. But what it really led to, and this actually has repercussions on the MCP itself, was the Nolan's affair, right? If you know about the Nolan's affair, it basically crippled the Far East Bureau for several years. In other words, all the communist movements in Southeast Asia were basically blind and lost after the Nolan's, Mr. and Mrs. Nolan's, the Hilaire Nolan's, right, were arrested. So we have to understand that, back then the NCP was not a true Malayan communist movement. This is still early stage. And to a certain extent, the first iteration of the MCP is still not a true Malayan communist movement. They are still very much tied to the old CCP led National Provincial Committee, right? Sorry, I typed, and it was NPC. They basically, a lot of the old NPC committee members, the Central Committee and the Standing Committee members, basically continue in their role in the new party until they were arrested, and then someone else, but it's continued, right? But the most successful act, or most successful activity they did was the labor union. Because the labor union, they basically got more people to join. A lot of people were afraid of the communist movement because they didn't want to have anything to do with them. And we must keep this in mind. In the labor union, they were talking about radicalizing workers, and a lot of the Chinese and Indian and Malay workers, especially the Chinese, they came here not to fight for some intellectual goal. They came here to find a better living. So why would they jeopardize their living and get banished back to China by joining the communist movement, right? But labor union was good for them because it would force their employers to give them better treatment, better pay and all that. And that was much more interested to them. But they didn't realize that they were led by this communists. Although maybe they know, they just don't care, but as long as I'm not a card-carrying member, I'm fine, right? And plus, as long as the Chinese Communist Party looms in the background, no non-Chinese would ever want to have anything to do with them. And this is basically a crippling weakness there, right? So we must understand that these are the weaknesses, right? Most of the leaders are urbanized Hainanese. It's a class difference. All these intellectuals from Hainan who speak Hainan, right, Hainanese, and the members are not. It's very difficult for them to follow somebody who's not. I mean, the whole clan system is very much very ingrained in a lot of early Chinese migrants. I mean, I'm sure a lot of you agree, right? And this is to some extent, people are more attached to their clan or to the dialect groups, right? And there's no ethnic diversity, all Chinese, right? Language literacy. The intellectuals were attracted because one of the things they did was they tried to educate the illiterate ones, and they provided the schools, but a lot of schools were shut down, open, close, open, close. Well, over 700 of them were open and closed by the British during this whole period. Many of the intellectuals were educated. The workers, although they're attracted, but they joined because I get to learn how to read and write. They're not really necessarily convinced by this movement. Say, oh, free education, why not, right? Who doesn't want free education university, right? Everybody wants it, right? But not because we're talking about basic education, how to read and write and count and all that. And plus the cultural barrier, we're talking about Hainanese culture being dominant. The meetings, they were conducted in Hainanese, although they were in Chinese. Only later on, they did sort of try to switch to to Mandarin Chinese, right? But it's still a very complicated issue. And all the teachers came from China. And they have this, many of these teachers have no idea of the condition in Malaya. They were basically teaching the students about love China, love Mao Zedong, love Chen Duxiu, love Marxism, love China. Basically, everything was China, right? So if you're not interested, especially you're Malayan born, why would you be interested? No. And one of the biggest issues Ho Chi Minh had with this was, and he said this to the MCP, right? Please learn Bahasa. Once you learn Bahasa, you can speak the lingua franca of the land. You can unite with the Malays and Indians to create a socialist state. Yeah, the MCP said, okay, sure. Very few did that, very few. Only the Malayan bonds, I would say many of the Malayan, not all, many of the Malayan bonds actually took this advice. But many of them refused to, or they were just more concerned about what's in China. And as I said, many of the early MCP leaders were China born, or they were refugees or exiles who were more interested in the revolution in China than here. And that's also the issue, right? Later on, when we have the new generations of Malayan-born communists, and that's when they realized that, oh, you know, things have to change. This is one issue, right? So when the party was formed in April 1930, these are the people who were involved, right? Sorry, you can see the picture very clearly, right? Wu Qing was in the what do you call that? And the NPC, right? And then he continues as head of party organization. Li Guangyuan took over, right? And so you have all this. Lin Qingchong was there. Fu Daqing survived, right? All this. But keep in mind, right? Except for Fu Daqing, right? Who's a Guangxi Ren, the rest, most of them are still Hainanese. So the party is still overwhelmingly Hainanese, and this is an issue. Right? I remember talking to the elder folks in Betong. They sort of grumble that Hainanese get to call the shots. You know, all the Hainanese always get to be troop leaders and all that. I was like, oh, really? Hainanese? Okay, so that's interesting. There's rivalry, you know, cultural rivalry that exists in the party, right? So the meetings after the MCP was formed, right? The second one was in Guang. It's interesting. And the third one, right? This is when we have the infamous 12 points. And I'm not going to list all of them. It's quite long, right? Dr. Chia Boon Keng actually had a whole file translated, so you can read that in his book, right? From Peikai to something, from Peikai to Comington, sorry, I can't remember the book title, but basically he collects all the documents, right? The primary sources of the MCP there. So one of the things that the MCP actually advocated, and this is the time when they actually switch their focus, or tries to, from looking at China and seeing what China is doing, and actually focusing what's happened in Malaya. This is the first time, and this is something we have to keep in mind. In 1932, during the third Representative Council meeting, right? They actually finally said, okay, we are now the Malayan Communist Party. We should be focused on Malaya, right? So who are the enemies here? The British, the traditional rulers, anyone who is supposed to be landowners who exploited the poor needs to go. And then they want to emulate China by doing the redistribution of the land, right? 土地改革, we call that, right, in Chinese, right? And so the MCP were poised in the perfect position because, as I said, the MGLU, the labor union, was their only and best tool. The party itself did not attract much attention. They could not, to be honest, they were very, very unpopular, right? Although they have all these grand ideals about expelling the British, but how do they do that? Well, they have the labor union. The working class were more subscribed to this whole idea of better treatment for laborers than communist ideals. So the MGLU was used to agitate for, you know, labor strikes and work stoppages. But in 1934, Comintern told them, you need to do more labor strikes. In fact, if they can establish Soviets, they did, right? In Singapore, Johor, Selangor, in fact, several places they did strikes, but only in 1937, the Batu Arang strike where they had the first Soviet, right? They call themselves the Bolsheviks at the time. And it lasted for 2 weeks before the police came and arrested and shot the rest. 2 weeks. But what did it tell you about this? That the labor union had that kind of firepower. I mean, the labor union had members in upwards of thousands, several thousands, in fact. The MCP, on the other hand, had maybe at most 300 plus, less than 400. For a party that's supposed to represent all the working class, right? The labor union was much more popular. And this is something that we need to keep that in mind, right? Then when the Japanese invaded China, right? And when the Kuomintang and the CCP reconciled, there was this whole change in attitude in the British and also in China. Now the MCP is very funny. The Malayan Communist Party still takes orders from Kuomintang. They do, they respect Kuomintang. But on the other hand, they respect the Chinese Communist Party more because why? Similar cultural roots and because they were sort of mentored by the CCP. So they're in a way, they're serving two masters. So when the Kuomintang and the CCP basically, you know, united after the Xi'an incident, right, to unite against China, against Japan, right? But British sort of softened their stance. And because the British were basically protesting against Japanese aggression in China, and the Japanese were not happy with the British. So the British sort of trying to maintain good relations with Japan, but yet at the same time, they were sort of wants to allow the Chinese community in Malaya to sort of voice their discontent. And this allowed the MCP and the MGLU more freedom movement. Before then, they were just coming and arresting everyone, but now they could. And for those who study, and I think Dr. Voon knows about this as well, those who study about the student and the student movement in Malaya, right? A lot of all these 抗敌后援会 and the 救国会, all these national salvation organization societies, right? They sprung up because why? They want to show their support for the motherland. A lot of these are Malayan bonds, right? They want us to help China. Some volunteered to fight in the army, some in the Kuomintang army, or they joined the Mao Zedong's army in Yan'an. You know, they basically they were volunteers. Is it Yan'an? I forgot. I'm a bit wrong. So this with the British sort of softening their stance, the labor unions and the Malayan Communist Party basically, you know, because they were the one who were very they're experts in organization, in how to form all these groups of society. So they naturally, you know, with their knowledge, they became leaders. They are the ones leading all this. And all these impressionable youngsters, even adults, join in, you know, as long as you can boycott or you can bash the Japanese, you know, verbally or basically, you know, destroy their products. Hey, why not? It's anti-Japan time, right? And this allows a lot of indoctrination, brainwashing, if you want to call it, right? If you want to be cynical about it. The NCP basically use the labor unions and of course their own agents teach all this to. And if you read the memoirs that, like for my PhD, I did research on the memoirs and all this former guerrilla fighters for the Malayan Communist Party, right? Many of them said it was these anti-enemy background societies and national salvation associations, right? Their experience in these groups actually radicalized them. They were inspired, you know, they saw the injustice. And, you know, with all the education they're getting in school, and some of the teachers were communists themselves, telling them, oh, you could do this, all that. They became, you know, convinced that, you know, socialism is the way, Marxism is the way, right? And here's the funny thing. As you know, in 1932, the Malayan Communist Party were focusing in Malaya, but yet now, they switch direction and say it's all about protecting China. The whole tone changes. And one moment you say Malaya is your homeland, the other moment you say China is my homeland too. So which one it is? So the Chinese community had a binary of loyalty in this point, right? The exceptions are the English educated ones. They are firmly in the British Empire side. They see themselves as better, right? So the MCP, you know, basically had a free hand and educated there. I'm not gonna go talk about what happened with this, but basically they advocated a lot of good ideals. So the standing committee in 38, you know, basically promoted a lot of this, you know, these things can be found online if you know it. I mean, not completely, but these are the things they've been fighting for, you know, unity, right? I mean, many of these, sadly to say, are lip service. I would say that because it is impossible to achieve as long as the party is still Chinese dominated. The British are not going to care about unity of race. Reform the political structure and lose their colonial holdings? No way. 8-hour work weeks? No, this is not a worker's heaven. Work, you know, you have to work. Reform the military. This is basically allowing more local people to participate. No? Universal education? Oh, no way. The British not. Right? Fascism was on the rise. Okay, maybe the British will allow. Assist China, punishing spies. You know, you know, they were so convinced of Trotsky as counter-revolutionists, but where you can find them? You know, absolute freedom to the people. Oh, this is no way. A lot of the MCP thought that, you know, Malaya is a country at the time. Malaya was not a country. It was a disparate territories, you know, loosely governed by the British. You want to do this, you have to have a country. Malaya was not a country at that time. And this is something we need to understand at that time, right? So we have all this, right? I'm not going to go into detail of the structure and organization, but basically, you know, they're basically a very centralized and top-down, right? The central committee members pick the standing committee and they decide who gets to do what. This is how Lenin would do, and this is what they basically emulate, right? And in 1935, right, they switched committee. In fact, one thing I need to point out is every 1 to 2 years, there's always a new central committee member. Because why? They are constantly raided by the special branch, and they keep getting sent back to China. Right? These were all the China-born leaders, right? And the only thing that managed to retain is party discipline. That's the only thing. Now, the party could not grow. The only part that actually grew is the labor union, the MGLU, right? And many of the members are still China-oriented. Keep in mind, the early members were all from China as well. Malayan-born Chinese were still in small numbers. And why would they want to participate in a movement that had nothing to do with them if you're all talking about China? The Malayan-born are more concerned about Malaya, right? And one of the key weakness was that they denounced the sultans and the rajas here, right? And the Chinese businessmen felt that they have nothing to gain by supporting MCP. So there you go. The moderate Chinese who could not find themselves to support a movement that had brought no benefits. I mean, this is human nature. Why should I support a movement that's going to deprive me of my livelihood? No way. And as I said, many of the Chinese laborers who came to Malaya were here to look for a better life, not to cause trouble, not to start revolution. It is intellectuals who wanted all this, and yet they are still focused on China. Right? So they have no money, they could not speak Malay or not even English, and the local Chinese just basically keep away from them, especially the Malayan-born Chinese, right? And then the Malays even have nothing to do with this. Oh, this is a foreign party. Why the Malays still saying this is a foreign organization? Had nothing to do with it, because it is a foreign organization. You can't blame the Malays for that. And the Indians even worse. I said, oh, I'm not. You are talking about Malaya. I'm not even a citizen of this land. I have not. Why should I worry about this? With the exception of straight settlement-born Indians, just like the Chinese, those who were born in Malaya would probably be more interested, right? So we know that, you know, they have no financial support after Joseph Ducroix's arrest, the Nolan affair, right? And then the PKI was picking up speed. The Indonesian communists were picking up speed, and the Malays were like, if I want to join, I join somebody who I understand, right? The only time they have one Malay in the Central Committee was Sultan Junaid, who was ex-PKI exile. in 1936. One, right? He could speak Chinese. That's the key thing. He could speak Chinese. If he could not speak Chinese, that's it, right? So when the war came, right, they, as I said, the MCP had all this opportunity to do all this. They got their time under the sun by organizing all these anti-Japanese activities from July 1937 onwards, right? Which is why the Japanese hated them so much and hunted them down, right? And again, the party leadership remains overwhelmingly Hainanese, mostly in their 20s, right? Very young people, right? Although there were factionalism, there were purges, but it doesn't affect them much, right? So this is what happens to the party. And the MCP was so desperate for money, they actually had their own special branch, basically robbers. They actually conduct robberies, right? Which is sort of interesting to think about it. So things start to change in 1936, right? Not much start, right? And this is a little bit repeat of what I just said, right? 36 is when Chieh Bai-yun, right, elected as party secretary and then as deputy. Chieh Bai-yun is Hokkien, I believe, and Lai Tek is Vietnamese, right? They finally brought some changes. And the Far Eastern Bureau in 1934, this is after the Nolan's affair, they managed to reconnect with the MCP. And they gave a directive and saying that it's time to do sabotage work. Use the labor unions. And what they did, the MGLU was still overwhelmingly Chinese, but they start to manage to, a lot of the new labor leaders were bilingual. And that's a good thing, but not the MCP itself, but the labor union. And they managed to infiltrate the Indians, the Indians and Indian workers and the Malay workers and get them to form the Red Labor Union, the first multiracial labor union. And they did a strike in 1936 very successfully. Although they did not manage to destroy military and transportation facilities in Singapore, but they did sort of delay and sort of cripple the economy for a short while, right? And this was the few times where the so-called communists did something. Keep in mind, the MGLU leadership has dual membership, right? One in the labor union, one in MCP. But the key thing is only the labor union was doing most of the hard work, right? Then in 1938, they passed under Chieh Bai-yun and Lai Tek, they passed the 10-point program, which is basically a moderate policy. They dropped the whole anti-imperialist and anti-British argument there, and saying that, oh, we should unite with the colonial authorities to fight Japan. They anticipated the coming of the Japanese, right? But the British ignored them, right? So when the British ignored them in next year, in April 1939, they switched back to anti-imperialist, which includes the British. Originally, it was anti-fascist. But when the British ignored them, they go back to the aggressive thing, right? But in 1937, there was an MCP Indian branch. They called themselves the Indian Communist Party. And interestingly, they were English-speaking Indians. Straight settlements, Indians mostly. Indians who were educated in the English system, right? Later they called themselves the Friends of China Society. And they recruited over 200 English-speaking Indians in Malacca. And then what they did was they translated all the MCP propaganda for the Tamil and Hindi and Urdu-speaking members of the Indian community, right? And it was actually spreading. It was very successful until the special branch came and swooped and took everybody away, right? And many of them disappeared. Nobody knew what happened to them actually. That's something that we should look at in the future. We know there's no Malay participation in the entire movement because even though the MCP launched something called the Malayan Racial Emancipation League, it was starting to pick up steam because it's basically, you know, for a sort of a egalitarian, all for all races kind of thing, you know, just get rid of the white man kind of whole argument. It's a league where the anti-imperialist. But once the Japanese invaded China and MCP switched to wholeheartedly supporting China's war, everybody left. So we have the Kesatuan Melayu Muda was rising at the time, everybody left it. And the ex-PKI members who were in the elite went back to the Netherlands East Indies. So that's it. And like that, I think everybody knows, right? Infamous triple agent, right? He's a Vietnamese who basically lied to everybody, tricked everybody, right? Very well versed, right? He's probably the most damaging aspect and the most damaging aspect of the MCP's history. After Chieh Bai-yuen was arrested and exiled in April 1939, right? He was the one who basically pushed the party into extremism, you know, with the anti-imperialist policy. And he basically wasn't exposed until Hong Ye-lu saw him exiting the Kempetai office in Singapore. Hong Ye-lu was forced to be a collaborator and was a translator for the Kempetai. And he saw, you know, like that getting special treatment and all that. And he exposed him in 1945, but because the fact that he was a collaborator, forced collaborator, nobody believed him, right? Until Ali Min, a Malay Comintern agent who was a member of the PKI as well, who came to Singapore and visited Litek. He wants to meet the leader of MCP and say, I don't recognize you. Keep in mind that Litek always claims that he's a Comintern agent, sent by Comintern to lead them. So everybody worship him like, oh, he's like basically a god in Malayan Marxism, because nobody knows more about Marxist theory than him. Then when Ali Min said that, I don't know you, I know everybody in Comintern. For the Southeast Asia office, but I don't know you. When did you join? Litek disappeared because the party wanted to open up an inquiry. He took everything. He took all the money, right? About 20,000 Straits dollars, right? And with his fourth wife, right, disappeared. And as we know, Chin Peng was quickly elected to lead a special task force, which is actually him alone. Chased Litek to Hong Kong, back to Bangkok, and by the time he found him, he was strangled to death by the Thai communists, and his body was burned in a ditch. No proof. Whether or not that's true, nobody knows. This is what we only know from what Chin Peng could tell us, right? Because he was trying to run away. But Litek's legacy, and he's still famous in our story. Somebody should make a movie about him. I don't know. Maybe Victor can suggest something. So. In wartime, I'm not going to go too detail. In wartime, we know that the MCP challenged the British with more strikes because, you know, Litek is pushing the buttons at the back. It's very strange because he could bring down the party anytime, but yet the special branch kept him there, right? As the Japanese aggressions became more and more evident, especially when the Chinese Communist Party say, you know, let's not do all this anti-imperialist movement. Let's work with the colonials to fight a bigger enemy, which is the fascists. They did in 1941. They said, okay, let's make peace with the British to fight the Japanese. And at this time, membership jumped because why? They start to promote saying that, oh, we're going to work with the British to fight the Japanese. I think the message of fighting the Japanese was more, I would say, more favorable to a lot of the Chinese. So a lot of people joined it at the time. Before that, it was only 300 over members, and now suddenly you have 5,000, right? And we know that once the Japanese landed at Kota Baru, there was a quick agreement where they opened up the 101 Special Training School, where they trained 165 men, mostly from the MCP. Some of them were in jail, you know. 10 days of training, how to use guns, how to plant bombs and all that. And then they sent them to the jungle. About 1/3 of them died within the first month. But those who survived became the core of the MPAJA, the Malayan People and Anti-Japanese Army, right? And they were very lucky because, I would say lucky because a lot of people willing to help them. When they heard that, hey, you're going to fight the Japanese, right? Yeah, sure, of course. You know? So you have civilian networks, you know, people would just pass messages, supplies, and some even volunteered, right? And of course, the SOE, the Special Operations Executive, were dropping supplies and weapons, submarine supplies and all that. Dinding is a very famous place. But we have to admit that the MPAJA were not strong enough to have an open battle with the Japanese. No matter what they say, it's mostly ambush attacks. Small scale attacking stations and guard posts and outposts and all that. Harassment and sabotage attacks, right? There's no like grand 1,000-strong siege and all that. No, they did not have the support. Right? They were very good at what they're doing though, setting traps and ambushes, but they were never a field army. So we have to keep that in mind. They call themselves army, but they were more like ragtag freedom fighters. Right? So when the Japanese finally surrendered after 3 years and 8 months, they came out and took control, right? In the name of the MPAJA, but actually it was the MCP, right? This is the spark that actually caused the Malays from indifferent to actually outwardly hating them. It's because a lot of the Malays were willing to point out who were the MCP because they just didn't want to be harmed by the Japanese. And so what did the MCP do? Did retaliation, executions and all that, right? And only when the British came back. And then again, there were some debates, and I discussed this with some of the people I met in Patong. Like, why didn't you guys fight back? Why didn't you guys sort of continue the fight? I mean, there were some survivors from the MPAJ there. You know, you had everything. I mean, of course, you control the countryside, but you could fight a protracted war with the British. They say, well, we could, but to be honest, they knew they could not fight the British with all this firepower because the British now has its focus firmly on Malaya. The Japanese had given up. So a lot of them saying yes, some of the more militant ones were willing to fight to the death, but then again, Lai Tak stopped them. So on one hand, they hated White Lai Tak for stopping them to resist the British in September 1945. But on the other hand, they knew that if they do fight on, all of them are going to get killed. And we might see more desertion because there's no reason to fight anymore. So they may put the blame on Lai Tak, but to be honest, they knew they could not win. So that's all. So in the post-war era, the party basically gained semi-legal status, right? In a way, they are tolerated. They lost the MPAJ, but they kept a lot of the weapons that were dropped by the SOE. And they divide themselves into the open and hidden group, right? The open ones, like Chin Peng, they openly walk out and they promote their ideology, open offices and all that. You know, basically act like a legal political party, first time in their lives, right? And those hidden are the ones who are still hiding in the jungles, you know, maintaining the bases, you know, and also keeping all the weapons and all. A lot of things they did not tell the British. That's how they survived when the emergency began. And under Lai Tak's encouragement, they went for the popular front strategy of immunizing Mao Zedong's, and they went back and did more labor activities, and they formed the Pan-Malayan General Labor Union. You know, we know the story of S.A. Ganapati, who was the leader, and they went back to all these labor strikes, right? And this time we have leftist Malays in the Malayan National Party and the English-speaking non-Malays forming the Malayan Democratic Union. They're leftists, but they're English-speaking. So they join in to do all these strikes, right? And hartau today in Malaysia is a banned word. You cannot say this word openly, right? The AMCJ, which is basically a union or alliance of Malayan Democratic Union along with other smaller groups, and the Malayan National Party formed their own Malay leftist group called the Pusat Tenaga Rakyat. They formed this coalition and they proposed this People's Constitution. This is when the Malayan Union was being proposed. And they managed to push out this before the Malayan Union plan was announced, and not because they knew the Malayan Union was coming. Now, why I mention this is because the MCP had a hand in it, especially in the Malayan Democratic Union. Some of the memberships in MDU were communists, right? They were they were hidden members or secret members. And some of the ideas they proposed were very similar to what the party proposed in the 30s, right? So it is not surprising that the British see themselves as just another MCP stooge, right? The MCJ Putra, right? So what did they do? The British knew that eventually, with the Malayan Union being established, there's going to be a trouble with the communists. It was a marriage of convenience, right? And what you can find out is that all these laws were established in 45 to 48, right? The last two, the Sedition and Emergency Regulations Bill, were debated, but they haven't been enacted right before the emergency. And what you can see, and this is what CC Chin has mentioned this, and I, from what I see, and I concur with him, and also I went ahead, I'll take one more step further, saying that the British wanted the emergency to happen. They knew there was going to be a confrontation, right? The common enemy is gone. They were recuperating, right? It was deliberately to provoke them. Say, you know, you want to punch somebody in the face, you want to make him throw the first punch. And this is what the British did. You know, suppress them, you know, provoke them, get them so mad that, you know, that we can legally come in and did that. And it happened 16 June 1948. Chin Peng mentioned in his memoir that he had no idea, it wasn't under his control, and he did not know who were they, and it was a robbery. And then I heard there was another theory I heard that these people were robbers and murderers. They had nothing to do with the MCP. But the third one, which I found it very, very fascinating, is this is from people that I interviewed in Batong. They told me they knew who were the murderers. They knew who they were. And they did sort of take action without Chin Peng's knowledge so that he has deniability, possible deniability. And they wanted to set an example to the British and the Europeans basically saying that you are not safe anymore. Before this, the party has always refrained from killing anyone, especially Europeans. They would threaten them, but never kill them. But now, a local party cadre, right, which the old people knew, but they refused to tell me, of course, you know, afraid of retaliation. They said they knew who they were. And it was deliberate, is what they say. And they did it without Central Committee's knowledge until after the fact. But it was done to give the Central Committee and Chin Peng deniability. Because everybody say, oh, he directed it, but he didn't. So this is the part which is probably going to be very difficult to find out, right? Whether or not these people who murdered these European planters will ever be found, we don't know, right? So then again, the British had their perfect smoking gun. Might as well swoop in. The next day was Perak. Then the following day was entire state. Lockdown, shutting down MCP offices, mass arrest, anyone suspected, right? At that time, anyone who is suspected, you know, even a little bit of suspicion, you get arrested. And all it takes is somebody, you know, write a small note to the police and saying that my neighbor is a communist. That's it, you're gone. No proof needed. Under the emergency regulations, right, you don't need proof to arrest and banish someone. Even you can execute them. Basically, it's a carte blanche for the British to do everything they want. Well, it is basically I would call a shotgun measure. You cannot separate who is communist, who is not communist. Might as well, you know, arrest the whole lot. You know, so this is what the British did. So 23rd July, MCP declared illegal, right? And there was a call to arms. Many of the MPAGA fighters refused to call to arms because they were happy. And remember, most of the anti-Japanese army members were not communists. They were not. They were just fighters who want to get rid of the Japanese. Only the hardcore ones joined them, right? So the National Liberation War began, right? We know from CC Chin's research and also from other sources that they had prepared. Chin Peng himself has said, oh, we were prepared. We were planning to the revolt in September. Timetable has moved way ahead because of that murder, right? So they did try to establish liberated zones just to emulate CCP again. They couldn't, right? So they were always on the move. The jungle is the only place that protected them, right? And the Mingyun came about at this time, you know, basically the same network, all that. And again, they returned to the whole system of jungle warfare, guerrilla warfare, ambushes, sabotages, and all that, right? And the British was so reluctant to call this a war because it was a shooting war, because insurance, right? Yes, the greatest evil in this world is always the insurance companies. Right? Don't get me wrong. We all have to pay insurance. Don't get me started on insurance. Anyway, so even the British have to placate the claims and all the property owners and all that, right? So, but then again, the British, even though they call it an emergency, right? They spend 7 times the amount. Oh, okay, compared to what they spent in their national defense budget at that time, right? They spend 7 times more on Malaya. This is how important it is to them. Not even the Mau Mau rebellion in Kenya had cost that much money, but Malaya, yes. Because why? The rubber. They need rubber for everything. So while the Malayan National Liberation Army calls it a liberation war, which to them it is. They were very convinced because this is to liberate Malaya from the British. They knew what the British were doing. The British, all they wanted was the rubber, right? And then this is what of our famous happy elf, who is now deceased, right? He is interesting because he is a Malayan-born leader. He's not China-born, radicalized. And it was a British teacher who radicalized him. Haha, not China. British teacher, his English teacher radicalized him. So before people start pointing out, say, oh, the Chinese communists, no. His English teacher, who left Britain because he couldn't stand the politics there, actually gave him all the books. He gave Chin Peng the book, Red Star Over China, and that really inspired him. Of course, he had a hero in Tu Longshan who died in China as well. And he's probably the first generation or the only generation of bilingual or trilingual or quadrilingual Malayan communist leader. I mean, he could speak English, Malay, Chinese, and even Thai, I heard. Right? And he was John Davis' good friend during the war, right? John Davis was a commander from Force 136 at the time, and he was the one who spoke it. And Chin Peng being Malayan born and also, you know, being bilingual makes him a perfect leader. Is why, because he lived for quite a long time until he died in Bangkok in September 2013. And just to interject a short anecdote, right? I was about to interview him through his cousin who was living in Sydney when I heard news he passed away. And that was my greatest regret. I couldn't manage to interview him. Anyway, the following years is a long stalemate, right? And the 12 years of emergency, right? Actually, the only highlight is 49 to 51 or 52 we want to go to. Those were the few years that was really extreme. Not extreme, really intense, the word is intense, the war, right? Although MCP was caught with the pants down, figuratively speaking, they could not emulate the CCP at all. There was no liberated zone. The Minyuan network was fully organized. The people were indifferent to them because they were not going to fight another war. So, no, enough is enough. They were tired, right? People just want to be left alone, right? And when they did not have enough supplies, what they do? They force. At first, it was okay. You know, they come off the jungle fringes, they go to the squatters in the village. Most of these squatters moved to the jungle fringes from the towns when the Japanese came. And they were too lazy to move, or not so too lazy, I shouldn't say. It couldn't be bothered to move away because they've already settled down for several years. And so they were perfect for recruitment and so for information and for everything. And this is how they get it. And when people refused to give them, because they were still rebuilding their lives, they forced them, they tortured them and all that. And sad to say is, and I spoke to this with the survivors in Batong, they said, because they were so desperate for members, they allow a lot of gangsters and thugs to join them, robbers, criminals who were on the run from the police, who basically came up to the MCP and say that, I want to join your revolution. I believe in you. Actually, they're not. They have a warrant for their arrest for murdering or did something nasty. So they have a lot of nasty characters in the party. They did not have the benefit of the convicted, the really idealistic one. No, there were a lot of never-do-wells party. So some of these violent acts were done by this. It is what they told me, which I think is a mixture of that and also the fact that they were so hungry, they're willing to use the gun in their hand to force you to give them some rice. And it plays into the British propaganda machine because, hey, they're no different from terrorists. And they were acting as terrorists. And this is the problem, right? And of course, you know, the British being wanting to keep their precious territory, they would do that. You know, the rubber was very important. Right? Whatever the MCP wanted to do, you know, my socialist state, first of all, the original problem of from the Nanyang Provincial Committee all the way to the first generation of the MCP is still not resolved. That is the language and the cultural barrier. Right? Many of the members still do not speak Malay. Right? So as the war dragged on, you know, with derailments and cutting of telephone lines, telegram lines, all that, right? The British just pour in more troops. But the only shining beacon in the war for the MLA side, right, was the forming of the 10th Regiment, and the all Malay 10th Regiment. And this is probably only shining point, and most of them from Pahang. The people of Pahang had always hated the British, and because they are part of the unfederated Malay states, they don't see a reason to be loyal. And since there was an active resistance army, they won in. That was the reason, right? And then we have the story of Henry Gurney being assassinated, which is sort of unexpected, right? It was sort of a bonus, and it was the only high point in the emergency for the communists, that they killed somebody so important, right? But it only led to more successive strategies. And I'm not going to go to all of this, right? But people always ask how, and people always came up with their own theory. What really killed, what really defeated the communists? It wasn't guns, it wasn't bombs. It was starvation. And this man, Sir Harold Briggs, right, was the one who starved them to submission, to be honest. Nothing works better than starvation if you want to force somebody to do what you want, right? And once the Briggs plan, where the resettlement of all the Chinese and Malay and Indian squatters into fortified strategic hamlets, which are the new villages, all the villages we have to, like, we have so many villages in Kajang here, right? That's when things change. The MCP funding, they could not replace casualties. There were no recruits because everybody's behind bars. There was no food, nothing. They could not rely on the Orang Asli to supply them. They retreated. Right? And then that's when they start to have negotiations, you know, because Chin Peng was originally lost contact after 1954 because he was retreating up north and he was taking a long route and all that. And people, the representative in Beijing contacted the British government and said that they want to talk. And that led to the Baling Conference, where we know that, you know, Chin Peng, you know, refused to budge because it was calling for surrender. And they said they want to lay down their arms peacefully. So with that failure, the war continues. But by 1960, there was no more shooting, very few. So that's where the war ended. And what happened to Chin Peng? He went to see Mao Zedong and became a scholar, right, and lived happily ever after, right, until 1989. Right. So there was no more fighting. The Malaya went on to become Malaysia. There was development and all that. We all know that, right? Then in 1968, on the eve of the emergence, on the anniversary, sorry, of the emergency in 17 June 1968, there was the downward strike. I think there's much research done on the downward advance. Southern advance of the resurgent MCP. You know, they were inspired by the Vietnam War. And Deng Xiaoping also told them, "Yeah, I'll give you money." So they went down, and that's when the war basically ramped up again. Although in Malaysian contemporary history, this is a separate war, but to the MNLA, the liberation war continues, in a sense, right? So, but then again, at this point, the MCP was just doing ambushes and running around, you know, bombing police stations and occasionally, you know, throw grenades here and there. And mostly because they had a purge. And this is some topic that's still being researched. And I actually started this project and talked to a few people in the peace villages. And they are still reluctant to talk about it, and because it's a painful memory. But there is a wealth of research can be done around this. Because what actually happened? I have many stories about this, but I don't think I have time to all this. But we do know that the party split into three after the purge between 68 to 1970, while the Southern advance was going on. Some of the regiments switched sides, joined the Marxist-Leninists and the Revolutionary Front, which strangely merged to become the Malaysian Communist Party, which is a very short-lived party, right? But most of this was really quiet. You hardly hear much news about MCP at this point. They were basically non-entity at this point, but they do kill people, but the security forces were in full control. So they had no clear goal and no clear progress. Chieh himself admitted it, and I've talked to the survivor. They were very reluctant to talk about this period. They still do, because they felt that it was sort of like a painful memory. I wouldn't say shame, but more like, you know, what was the reason they even moved south in the first place, right? Times have moved on, and they sort of missed the boat on that one, right? But then again, history is a funny thing. You know, Chinese always say 天时地利人和, the three things, right? Timing, the geography, and also the connection of people, right? Must be there, three elements, but it didn't happen for them. So after 87, you know, especially when the Malaysian Communist Party, where, you know, the breakaway group took the Thai army's offer to put down arms and to be resettled, that's when the main group, the remainder, the headquarters group also began to be contacted by the Thai army. So they say they served the Thai government willing to serve as a mediator to resolve this. And who reached out who first is still a question. I talked to the survivor. They said it was the Thai government, the Thai army general, Kitty Ratchanaya, who actually made the first gesture. And some say it was China who told them, stop fighting, time to make peace. And of course, we have the contemporary historical version, right? So what we know is that the Thai government brokered a peace, and Chieh returned from his study. And after several secret talks, they went to this Lee Gardens Hotel in Hat Yai and signed the agreement. And it almost failed to sign, you know, everybody, because the wording in media, they call it a surrender. And both the breakaway party and Chieh was not happy. Chieh is more like, let's just stop everything. But people was like, how can you call it surrender? We never surrendered. It's lay down arms. So in return for this, they were offered resettlement in the borderlands, right? Cholabon 12 is where the breakaway party settled down. I visited Cholabon 10, right? And then somewhere in Sungai Golok is where the 10th regiment is. That's another village there. But to be honest, the whole peace process came as a surprise. Nobody knew this was going on, except for headquarters party and also the breakaway party. And this is something that troubles a lot of the survivors today. Someone told me that they're willing to fight until they die. And this was something that they never expected to become farmers and have children.
Jason.
Yes.
How long more do you need?
Just on time. I know. I'm stopping up. Yes, I know. Last few slides. So the last thing I want to talk about is why for the retirees, right? The fighting never ends. Now they have a new war of knowledge. They want to be remembered, but they on their own terms, because they are very angry about how people have written about them, right? And this is where my PhD thesis came in. I went and interviewed them and read their writings and found things that supposedly shocking. So why did they write? Well, They want to tell people that we are still here, even though we are dead, we're still here. You know, they want to project the politics. They say they were not wrong. They were unrepentant, I must say. They want to say that they, you know, they were witnesses and they have testaments of history. And it's sort of a final act of defiance, saying, haha, you can't kill us, we're still around, sort of way. But the fun thing is they want to celebrate their journey. If you read their memoirs, it's something like a Boy Scout diary sometimes. And they want everybody people in the future to remember them. So with that's it.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jason.
Yeah. Sorry about that, taking a bit too long.
This has also been a long journey for us.
It is.
Starting from 1918. Now, this was before the founding of the Communist Party.
Yes.
Right.
Way before.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Right up to the present day. Now, actually, a good overview because you have done very intensive research on it. Now, for a young generation now, this could have been silent revolution, but our time, growing up in the 50s, it was a very visible struggle. Yep. You know, the new villages were just set up. There were curfews every day, killings, burning, sabotage, and so on. So in the 50s, it was very, very visible. It's not silent at all. So we grew up during that period, but of course, we were very ignorant of what had happened earlier, you know, the history that you recounted. Because this was a very sensitive issue until, I think, maybe until very recently.
Yes.
It was taboo, you know. So a lot of people would not know this part of the history, you know. But I think now there are more and more young scholars who are interested in this topic. And as you say, the participants themselves, the jungle fighters, they will also having their memoirs and so on, and making known their story. So I think this part of history is opening up somewhat. So with that, we don't have much time. It's already almost 4:40. We have to stop at 5 o'clock. Now I open up the discussion to the floor. I would wonder if there are questions or not in any language, in Chinese, English, or Bahasa. Anyone? Make your question short, you know, so that the Jason can.
I'll give short answers as well.
Yeah.
Dr. An, can I go now? Okay, selamat tinggal.
Oh, okay.
May I ask a question?
Yeah, sure, Victor.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I was thinking one of the things which, this is a question, the economic history background of the early British Strait settlement to the end of independence was a whole economic history which also sometimes not touched on in terms of this story. We know that tin and rubber were the sort of staple British industry at the time. And I think there's an economist in this group, Jomo, I think also in this discussion. And so he probably will tell you a bit more of
Jomo.
Jomo is here. I think he's in this. But
yes.
I would like to ask him, I would like to ask him if the economic history of the British at that time, from Strait settlement to up to the independence, there was no wage rise. Now, no wage rise means it was slave wage condition. Now, the slave wage condition was probably another drive for people taking a stand against the British at that time, rather than an ideological position of wanting to be a communist. It was to actually gain a living wage, which I think the British at that time, like they did during slave days and the empire days, they were very cruel. They forced wages to be so low that it was impossible to live during the British colonial days. So the people rising to the call of the Unionists, which came in the 30s, was very strong. And I wonder why, I just want to add to this story that you're telling, that besides the ideological beginning, which you have laid very good background, there was also the economic sad condition of low wages, which the economic history has also forced people to rebel. And it was a legitimate rebellion against the British at that time. It was a legitimate taking arms against them to force them out of the country as well. That's probably my little question. Was it has to do with the economic history as well?
Yeah, I think, okay, the short answer is definitely, most definitely. And if Dr. Jomo would like to add on later on, that'd be great. But what I found out is that, you know, this is a colonial, it was a colonial state. And the whole idea of colonial enterprise is about economics. It's all about making money. It's not about bringing the light of civilization to poor, ignorant savages. It's not. It's all about money. So why would you pay somebody who you treat as no better than slaves and give them better conditions? As long as they don't die off, you know, that's fine. You know, and labor unionism is something that's so attracted to them because why? Collective bargaining. So, you know, it gives voice. They don't care what's the ideological reason behind it. If I can get 30 cents as opposed to 10 cents a day. Yesterday, today I'm paying 10 cents a day, right? If tomorrow I get 30 cents a day, I'll vote for you. Why not? Why not? It's all about survival. And for a lot of laborers, a lot of them are uneducated. Sorry to say that, you know, they're illiterate, right? They're peasants, peasant background. And for somebody to fight for them and live their lives a little better, although what they're making is way better than what they make in China or India. Don't get me wrong. It's still better. Right? Better than dying in starvation, but still being treated like dogs and treated like slaves? No, right? So yes, I would vote for you if you fight for me for 30 cents a day rather than 10 cents a day, right? I don't know if Dr. Jomo has anything to add on to that, but I'm happy to finally meet Dr. Jomo here.
Prof. Jomo, any remarks from you? Oh, no. Okay.
Okay, yeah. I think I just managed to unmute. Thank you, Vic.
It's good.
Professor Voon, it's good to see you after so many years.
Nice to hear your voice again.
Yeah. I don't have a shirt on, so I'm
Never mind, we can hear you.
Let me first say, as far as Victor's question is concerned, very directly, I think there are three considerations I would emphasize. The economic conditions of the British Empire in Malaya are a complex, changing story. You know?
Yes.
And for example, the role of opium trade in an early period is important. You know, and the way the taxes were collected from things like opium, from alcohol, from gambling, even prostitution, and this happened mainly in the Strait settlements and Johor. But I think what happens later as production becomes important, the US Civil War was very important in terms of increasing the demand for tin. That was the first war where tin cans were used to sustain the armies during that war. So I think the general economic conditions in the empire, in the world economy as a whole, and in Malaya were very important. But of course, the story changes significantly in the 20th century with rubber, and rubber becomes extremely important, and the control of labor becomes important. But there were different modes of controlling labor, as we know. You know, even the use of indenture as applied to Indians changed over time. As applied
the coolie, right? The coolie system, right?
Yeah, but it was not a static system. It changed over time, and it applied differently to different dialect groups and at different stages. Professor Voon much more about all this, you know. And then you also have even Javanese labor were brought in on indentured terms. You see, so you have very, very different conditions. But I think, and all this has been shown. There was a good book written about 70 years ago by Lee Dunjan And there's another, even Sultan Nazrin's book on the Malayan economy during the first 4 decades of the 20th century really shows the significance of all this. But very crucially, in the period after the war, the contribution, why did the British hold on so much to Malaya? They were prepared to give up India, they were prepared to give up much of South Asia, but they held on because Malaya was making the biggest contribution to the entire British Empire in terms of foreign exchange earnings and so on. And this, I think, is very important to remember, you know, that it was, I mean, Britain was largely destroyed by German bombing during World War II. So the industry was all gone. They had nothing much to export, and so on and so forth. This was the home of the Industrial Revolution. But what was left of British industry? Not very much. So the empire, and especially this part of the empire, became so important. And I think, you know, without getting into too much detail about that, but since I have the floor, if I may, Professor Voon, ask Jason a question.
Yeah.
I think what your presentation underscores is the extent of special branch infiltration.
Oh yes.
Yeah, and the success of special branch infiltration. You know, in the 1980s, they even had detailed lists not only of the names but even of the occupational backgrounds of over 1,500 people. You know, who were underground, so to speak, at that time. You know, so it suggests a high degree of infiltration, and we only know about Lai Tak. It's not clear to me whether Lai Tak was actually Vietnamese or Sino-Vietnamese, because he spoke a lot of Chinese dialects, you know, and he was very, very versatile, and this was part of the reason he could get away with how much. But we only know of him as a triple agent. How many double agents were there? You know, how many people were forced to collaborate, and so on and so forth. These are important things which we don't know, and this is why accounts from people who were involved in the anti-communist activities, people like CC2 and you know, Chieh and all these other people, become extremely important in trying to understand the entire process. And why was it that it was so vulnerable to such infiltration? You know, this, I think, it becomes extremely crucial in terms of understanding what actually happened. Now, I think from the late 1950s, basically, as your account implies, you know, Chin Peng is basically marginalized. Okay, and so who leads the party?
Who leads the party? Is that your question?
Who leads the party at that stage? You see, and what leads? For example, when the revival of armed activity begins in the late 1960s, was it inspired by, what was it inspired by? Was it inspired by
the North Vietnamese?
Well, that's one way of looking at it. It could have been inspired by the Cultural Revolution. It could have been inspired by a Lin Biao version of the Cultural Revolution.
Well, I spoke to them, and sorry, Dr. Joe, if you have finished your question, so sorry.
Yeah. So I think you know, it's, and then how all that had to do with the breaking up of the party into 3 factions. You see, I think there are still many puzzles which we don't understand. You know, and is the breaking up due to successful special branch infiltration, or is it due to other factors? These are all very important ongoing questions which need to be addressed. And I think the different trajectories of the different communist parties in the region is also worth looking at. Of course, there's too much to ask for one study, you know, but the fact that many other parties, you know, I mean, the Communist Party in Singapore is supposed to have been so broke in the 1950s, had different factions, you know, and you know, and this might be true in other parts of the country. So how do we begin to understand and make sense of all this? And you know, these are questions which I'm curious about, but maybe it's too much for one session. For this session, since we have limited time, you know.
Yeah, and so Dr. Jomo, you have several questions there. I'll try to answer that. In fact, some of the questions I've already asked, and I've tried to find out, and directly from survivors and also from reading and researching, right? And who led the party after the 50s was basically, it's a successive, basically at first, Jinping did the remote control version. He was in China, he sent messengers back and forth, and he sent his right-hand man, the MCP version of Zhou Enlai, which is Shan Wuhong, okay? Which he basically, you know, run the party on his behalf while he's away in China until Shan Wuhong got really sick and was sent to China instead. And successive committees, when they formed the North Malaya Bureau, where they ran the show. And to be honest, when I asked them, like, who really ran the party? They said they gave autonomous powers to each individual regiment. That's what they did. They basically had no actual centralized leader, although nominally it was Jinping running things from Beijing. But in fact, it was on autopilot. And the idea was to not fight until they managed to replenish their numbers, which they never did. At their height, when they launched their southern assault in 1968, it was only about 3,000, the most, men at arms. And most of them were not Malayans, they were Batong Chinese. And so they did not know, even the men on the ground did not know who was their leader. In fact, some of them don't even know who is Jinping. They only know their local regional committee leaders, that's it. So the answer is that there was never an actual leader, although they have a nominal leader. So it is a fractured image, it's a kaleidoscope of the situation. Nobody knew who's running what, they only know who they answer to. That's the problem. And what was your question again? What's the second one? Sorry, I just caught it.
Since we have very little time, since we have time, I think we should give others an opportunity to engage with you.
Okay.
I think I've monopolized too much of your time already.
Oh,
sorry.
No.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jomo.
Yeah.
Do we have other questions from the floor? I thought Joe Liao is, yes, please, the Rush.
Dr. Rush, yeah.
Yeah. Please.
Yes, thanks for such a good talk. I learned so much from this. One of the most interesting things for me was to hear about Ho Chi Minh's role in the formation or attempting to form the party in the 1930s and so. My question is, why were the members of this movement in the various organizational forms so reluctant to do what Ho suggested they do, which was learn language, right? And create a bigger popular movement in the place where they were hoping, you know, to achieve their goals?
Okay, I think the short answer is it's sort of a cultural discrimination. They don't see the Malays as important enough. They sort of think that, you know, we're Chinese, we came from China, we should focus on China. Although we do want to spread the light of communism to everyone else, but it was only the Chinese who respond because they speak our language, it's easier. And to learn a new language is troublesome. Many of them are already adults. They do not have the cultural background, and I don't think they have the time for that either. The only exception is a few who manage to actually, because of the nature of their jobs, they have to interact with Malays, then they actually had chance to sort of in their maybe pidgin or broken Malay, try to teach them what is communism. But other than that, they are very much invested in what's going on in China rather than what's in Malaya. And that was at that time. So they just pay lip service to Ho Chi Minh, say, okay, we'll do it, but they didn't, right?
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Yeah.
We have another 5 minutes. Maybe you 1 or 2 more questions from the floor. Joe Liao, I thought you were looking for materials on this part of the issue.
Hi, Professor.
Hey, Joe.
Hi, Doctor. Yes, it's a very inspiring talk that you share so many background information. Currently, I'm working on the confrontasi, which is actually the confrontation between Indonesia and Malaysia. So I do come across several documentations and declassified documents regarding the leftist movement. I guess I only have one question for you.
Yep.
During the confrontasi, as we understand that Indonesia was carrying out the Ganjam Malaysia campaign, and then at the same time, there is a conspiracy, or rather a kind of philosophy thought, and thinking that the Communist Party Malaysia should take the opportunity, join hand in hand with the KPI to actually leverage the crisis of the formation of Malaysia. But according to my research and documentation and the interview, there is somehow rather quite a mystery, meaning that there is lack of understanding between the Communist Party in Malaysia and the PKI itself in regards to the formation of Malaysia and also the Sukarno's confrontasi policy. So I wonder whether Dr. Ng has anything to share with us regarding on this topic.
Oh, that's a very interesting question, because strangely, I managed to hear something about this. Okay, basically, I did ask. Okay, how it happened is I asked them, so do you have any context with other communist parties? They said, well, we do. The PKI and the Thai communists, but the Thai communists were more or less dissolved by the 60s. So they say that the PKI did make contact. Number one, because of geographical nature, it's very difficult to sort of cross the strait to contact them, right? That's number one. And number two, many of the MCP still did not learn Malay. To respond to the rest question, they didn't bother at all. Strangely, they speak Thai because of Lim Betong, but they refuse to learn Malay. So that's also a language issue. They required PKI members or messengers to learn Chinese to speak to them. So there was the language breakdown. And although there were feelers sent by both sides to see if we can work together and all that, right? Eventually, it did not work because, number one, the MCP were too exhausted after the emergency, right? They were like, oh, we can't just come in and join in and fight because we lost most of our men. They did not recover after the BRICS plan was implemented. They did not. Even with the Chinese volunteers from Betong, it's still not enough. And plus, their equipment were getting outdated by the 60s. They were still using World War II vintages. And unlike the PKI, who had somehow their constant resupplies and were going strong. And during the Ganjam Malaysia, yeah, I thought about that too. It's like, why didn't they just took the opportunity, you know? But no, basically, there was also sort of the abandonment, I would say the word abandonment of the MCP by Chin Peng. When he left, there was no one to drive the bus. So they were like, okay, do whatever you want, but just don't go and bomb Kuala Lumpur while I'm away. So, and then PKI, even though they were keen, I'm sure they were keen on trying to exploit this leverage, like Joe says, but the MCP side is like, they were unsure what to do with it, and this is how the whole thing died. I hope that answers your question, Joe. We can talk more about this.
Yeah, sure.
Thanks a lot, Joe. Okay, I think we have had a long session this afternoon. I
apologize for talking too much.
We enjoy ourselves, because we learn a lot from you. Very interesting research and a lot of details and so on that we were not known to me in my generation, and a lot of young people, of this generation. I hope this would inspire more young researchers to work on this topic or related topics. So with that, I thank Jason again for his very instructive, very, very good analysis of the situation. And I pass the floor back to Pai.
Yeah, okay. Thanks, Prof. Voon, and thanks, Dr. Jason. Okay, thanks all of you to attend our staff seminar. It's a very good discussion. and hope that have a nice day, all of you. Okay, thank you. Okay, so thank you so much.
Okay,
okay,
thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, everyone, for coming.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Good day.